I will call you Peter, and upon this rock I will build what I must call my church.
As Jesus came out of the temple and was going away, his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Then he asked them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be torn down." Matthew 24, verses 1 through 2. As we enter Holy Week, the church invites us to walk with Jesus towards Jerusalem, towards the cross. But before his passion, Jesus made a prophecy, one so bold it would have sounded impossible. The temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish religion and worship. It was the dwelling place of God among his people. It was the heart of the entire Jewish people. And yet, Jesus said it would be destroyed. And within a generation, it was. But what's often forgotten is what happened before its destruction. The events leading up to the destruction of the temple aren't recorded only in Scripture, but are described by ancient historians, including the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, the Roman historian Tacitus, and even the Jewish tradition recorded in the Babylonian Talmud. These are not Christian sources trying to prove Jesus right, and yet they describe a series of signs that are difficult to ignore. In this video, I want to take a look into all the strange phenomenon that took place at the temple leading up to its destruction. And we will start things off with the reports of a strange light. Josephus, the Jewish historian, writes, "On the 8th day of the month Xanthicus, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone round the altar in the Holy of Holies, that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour." Josephus, Jewish Wars 653. What's especially interesting is how the light was understood at the time it had shone. Josephus adds, "This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskilled, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as portending those events that followed immediately upon it. To many it seemed like a blessing, but to those trained in the scriptures, it was a warning." Another strange thing that was reported by Josephus revolves around the temple doors. Josephus continues, "The eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, was seen to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night." Josephus, War 563, once again. As Josephus says, these doors were so heavy that it took multiple men to open and close them. Yet in the middle of the night, they opened on their own. The priest knew something was not right. Speaking of the priests, we now move on to a 40-year-long set of signs that they themselves would have witnessed over and over again that would have been deeply troubling leading up to the destruction of the temple. Jewish tradition records a series of troubling signs that lasted for decades before the temple's destruction. In the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Yama 39b, it is written, 40 years prior to the destruction of the second temple, the lot for God did not arise in the high priest's right hand at all. So too, the strip of crimson wool that was tied to the head of the goat that was sent to Azazel did not turn up white, and the westernmost lamp of the menorah did not burn continually. So let's break all of this down. What does all of this mean? Well, first we'll start with the lot for the Lord that is mentioned here. Each year, the priest drew lots during the Jewish feast of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to determine which goat would carry the sins of Israel. The lot coming up in the right hand signified that God accepted the ritual. When the lot failed, it was a warning that God's approval had departed. The ritual could no longer guarantee atonement. Next, the red thread mentioned. During the Yom Kippur feast, which I covered in a different video, link in the bio, a crimson thread was tied to the scapegoat, and in the Jewish tradition, it was meant to turn white if the sins of Israel were forgiven. When the thread remained red, it symbolized that God's mercy was being withheld. The sins of the people remained unatoned. Up next, the light of the westernmost lamp of the temple kept going out. One of the menorah's lights was meant to burn continuously. When the lamp went out, it represented that God's presence was no longer actively sustaining the temple. This was a profound spiritual warning. Lastly, the doors opening by themselves. The Talmud echoes the reports of Josephus. As we already covered, the massive doors of the temple that normally required many men to operate opened on their own. The doors opening on their own was believed to symbolize a loss of divine order, almost as if the temple itself was reacting to the judgment that was coming, inviting the enemies in. Each of these anomalies might seem small on its own, but together they were impossible to ignore. The very signs of God's presence and approval, the rituals that maintained the temple, were failing. And remember, this was after the life, death on the cross, and resurrection of Jesus. The sacrifices could no longer atone for sin because the once and for all sacrifice had already been made. These decades-long warnings were a sign that judgment was coming and that the old system had fulfilled its purpose. But the signs don't stop there. Josephus records, moreover, at that feast which is called Pentecost, the priest said that in the first place they felt a quaking and heard a great noise. And after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." A voice was heard within the temple. This wasn't a human nor ordinary voice. As the voice said, the presence that once dwelled there was leaving. It's also worth pointing out that centuries earlier, the prophet Ezekiel had a similar experience before the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, when he had a vision of the Shekinah glory of God departing the first temple before its destruction, which the book of Ezekiel makes clear was a sign that judgment was coming upon the people of his time. Then the signs reach their peak. This is where things get spooky. Josephus writes, "A certain prestigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it so considerable in nature as to deserve such signals. For, before sunset, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding the cities." Jewish Wars 653. Now think about that for a moment. This isn't symbolic language from a prophet. This is an historian claiming that eyewitnesses reported seeing armies in the sky. And Josephus himself even admits that this sounds unbelievable, but insists it was reported by those who saw it. And this is not an isolated report. The Roman historian Tacitus records the same thing happening at the time of the destruction of the temple. He writes, "In the sky appeared a vision of armies in conflict, of glittering armor. A sudden lightning flash from the clouds lit up the temple. The doors of the inner shrine were suddenly thrown open, and a voice of more than mortal tone was heard, declaring that the gods were departing. At the same instant, there was a mighty stir, as of departure." Tacitus, Histories 5:13. Two historians, two different worldviews, one shared claim. Something was seen in the sky over Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple. And this is where the story becomes even more striking. When we look at the trial of Jesus before the high priest and the Sanhedrin, we read, "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Matthew 26:64. In the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, when God is described as coming on the clouds or coming to his people, it is understood as coming in judgment, not a physical appearance. It's also worth noting that elsewhere Jesus speaks of coming with his angels. So when eyewitnesses reported armies moving through the sky over Jerusalem, it could certainly be understood as a visible sign that God's judgment had arrived, and that the Son of Man had come with his heavenly hosts to execute judgment on the temple. Perhaps this event can even be understood as a shadow, a foreshadowing of Christ's ultimate coming with the angels as described in Matthew 16:27. In AD 70, judgment came upon Jerusalem and to the temple. But one day, the Son of Man will come again with his angels, not in shadow, but in fullness, to bring the final judgment. The center of God's dwelling among his people was now facing the consequences of rejecting him. And remarkably, some of those leaders who stood before him that night at the trial may have lived to see it with their own eyes. And yet, not everyone was caught off guard. According to the early Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, in his book Church Histories, he writes, quote, "But the people of the Church of Jerusalem were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city to depart from the city and to dwell in a certain town of Pera called Pella." End quote. They remembered the words of Christ from the Gospel of Luke. "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Luke 21:20 through 21. They took him seriously and they left. In 70 AD, the Romans besieged Jerusalem. According to Flavius Josephus, the destruction of the temple was so intense that even the very materials of it could not withstand the fire. He tells us that the temple was adorned with great quantities of gold that covered its walls, its gates, its sacred structures, and when the flames overtook the temple, that gold did not remain in place. It melted, and it liquefied under the heat, and began to run down into the cracks, seeping between the massive stones of the temple itself. And so, in the aftermath, when the fires had died down, the Roman soldiers looked upon the ruins. They knew that treasure had settled deep within the structure. And so, driven by greed, they did the unthinkable. They pried apart the stones. They tore them down one by one, ripping apart what had once been the holiest place in Israel, all in search of the gold that had melted into its very foundation. And in doing so, they fulfilled, down to the smallest detail, the words spoken by Jesus decades earlier. "Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be torn down." What may have sounded like crazy talk became reality. Not one stone was left on top of another. Not just destroyed, but completely dismantled. From a Christian perspective, this moment is not just about destruction, but fulfillment. Because by this time, the true temple had already come. As Jesus said in the Gospel of John, "Destroy this temple, and 3 days later I will raise it up." John 2:19. He was not speaking of stone, but of his body. From mysterious light to doors opening on their own, to 40 years of warning, to a voice departing from the temple, to literal armies in the sky. The fall of Jerusalem was not sudden. It was preceded, foretold, and fulfilled. And if Jesus was right about the destruction of the temple, then we should take seriously everything else he said.